You just spent $30 on a spool of premium fluorocarbon. You tied the perfect knot. You are fishing slow, just like everyone says you should. But you cannot buy a bite. Want to know why? Because that expensive invisible line you are so proud of has turned into a stiff, frozen wire underwater, and it is making your lure look like a lifeless piece of plastic. Today, we are breaking down a fishing truth that the big tackle companies do not want to talk about. I am going to show you exactly why your expensive fluorocarbon leader is ruining your natural bait presentation in cold water. I promise you, by the end of this video, you are going to rethink everything you know about winter tackle. Tell me in the comments right now, do you stubbornly fish fluorocarbon all year round, even in the freezing cold? This topic is absolutely crucial because we have all been brainwashed by fishing marketing. For years we have been told that fluorocarbon is the ultimate leader material. They say it is invisible, it sinks, and it is highly sensitive. And in the heat of the summer, that is mostly true. Because of this, fishermen have developed a blind loyalty to fluorocarbon. We tie it on all year long out of pure habit. We repeat the same actions, tying the same knots, throwing the same lures, and wondering why the winter bite is so unbelievably tough. But water temperature completely changes the physics of your fishing line. The habit of using one material for every season is the exact reason why so many guys struggle when the water gets cold. Picture this scenario. You wake up before the sun even thinks about rising. The air is so crisp it bites at your cheeks, and there is a thin layer of frost on your truck windshield. You pour that hot coffee, grab your gear, and head down to the lake. The water temperature is sitting somewhere around 40 degrees, maybe even high 30s. You are throwing a delicate little finesse jig. You tied on a brand new, expensive fluorocarbon leader because you want that ultimate invisibility. You make your first cast. The lake is perfectly still. You let the bait sink, and you wait. You give the rod tip a tiny twitch, expecting that bait to do a little dance down there in the dark water. But nothing natural happens. Down in the freezing depths, your high-tech leader has turned into a stiff, coiled piece of wire. It is completely killing the action of your lure. We have all been there, standing on the bank, wondering why the fish are ignoring us. The real culprit is tied right to your hook. Let us talk about the big selling point of fluorocarbon: invisibility. Every fishing magazine and every pro angler on television has hammered this idea into our heads for years. They tell you that because fluorocarbon has the same light refraction index as water, the fish simply cannot see it. And sure, in clear, warm summer water, that might be a massive advantage. But here is the hard truth that nobody wants to talk about. What good is an invisible line if it makes your bait look completely unnatural? Imagine you are a lethargic, cold water predator conserving energy. You see a little crawdad moving along the bottom, but instead of gliding smoothly, this thing is jerking around like it is attached to a stiff broomstick. It does not look alive. It looks mechanical and wrong. Fish are predators, and their survival depends on recognizing what is real food. In winter conditions, a natural presentation will outfish a perfectly invisible line every single time. To understand why this happens, we need to look at what fluorocarbon actually is. Without getting too deep into the boring chemistry, fluorocarbon is a very dense, heavy material. That is why it sinks, which is great for getting your bait to the bottom. But that density comes with a massive drawback when the temperature drops. Think of it like a stick of chewing gum. If you put a piece of gum in your pocket on a hot summer day, it gets soft, pliable, and flexible. But if you throw that same piece of gum into the freezer for a few hours, it turns into a rock. If you try to bend it, it might even snap. Fluorocarbon reacts to cold water in a very similar way. The moment it hits that 40-degree water, the molecular structure tightens up. The line loses its suppleness. It becomes totally rigid. That stiffness acts like a shock absorber in reverse. You shake your rod tip with incredible finesse, but that energy just travels down a stiff wire and awkwardly drags your bait. Now, think back to how your grandfather used to fish. Before fluorocarbon became the absolute standard for every single application, everybody used good old-fashioned monofilament. If you go into a tackle shop today and tell them you are tying a leader with monofilament, people might look at you like you are crazy. They will say it floats, it stretches too much, and the fish can see it. But let us look at how monofilament behaves in freezing conditions. Monofilament absorbs a tiny bit of water, and it has a much softer, more porous structure compared to fluorocarbon. When monofilament gets cold, it certainly gets a little stiffer, but it retains a massive amount of its original flexibility. It stays incredibly limp. That limpness is the golden ticket in winter fishing. When you impart action through a limp line, the lure is free to swing, glide, and fall exactly how it was designed to. The bait can actually breathe and look like a real living creature. Let us visualize a very specific scenario that happens all the time. You are out on the water, and the bite is incredibly tough. You decide to tie on a tiny, delicate finesse jig. You want to drag it slowly across the rocks. The whole appeal of a finesse jig is the skirt. When the jig hits the bottom and you pause, that silicone skirt is supposed to flare out slowly, mimicking a crawdad in a defensive posture. It is a beautiful movement that triggers big strikes. But if you are using a 12-pound fluorocarbon leader in freezing water, watch what happens. The stiffness of the line literally pushes against the eye of the jig. Instead of letting the jig sit naturally so the skirt can flare, the rigid line forces the jig to tilt forward or lay over awkwardly. When you try to shake it gently, the stiff line just hops the whole jig off the bottom in a jarring motion. You are taking a premium lure and ruining its underwater performance just because of your leader. Another classic winter technique is the suspending jerkbait. Anyone who chases cold water fish knows that the jerkbait is an absolute staple. You rip it a couple of times, and then you pause. And you wait. Sometimes you wait 10 or even 20 seconds. The magic of a suspending jerkbait is that it sits there, perfectly horizontal in the water column, looking like a dying shad. But what happens when you have a thick, freezing cold fluorocarbon leader attached to the nose ring? Because the line is dense and sinking, and because the cold has turned it into a stiff wire, the weight and rigidity of the leader will start pulling the nose of the jerkbait downward. Instead of sitting perfectly horizontal, your bait is now pointing down at a sharp angle. Real stunned baitfish do not sink nose first like a lawn dart. They hover. The fish come up, look at that bait pointing straight down with a stiff plastic wire attached to it, and they turn right around. Let us move over to finesse fishing, specifically the dropshot rig. The dropshot is supposed to be the ultimate weapon for pressured cold water fish. You have your weight at the bottom, and your little finesse worm suspended perfectly a foot or two up the line. When you use fluorocarbon for this in the summer, it works beautifully. The worm stands straight out. But do this in winter, and you run into a huge problem. Because the cold water stiffens the fluorocarbon so drastically, the tag end holding the hook becomes horribly rigid. When you gently shake a drop shot, the worm is supposed to quiver and shake independently of the sinker. But with a frozen fluorocarbon leader, the worm does not quiver. The entire rig just jerks up and down as one solid stiff piece. The worm cannot fold or undulate. You end up with a mechanical presentation. In clear, cold water, a fish has plenty of time to stare at your bait and decide that it looks totally fake. We need to have a serious talk about the fishing industry and the marketing traps we all fall into. You watch a popular fishing video, and the sponsored professionals are constantly talking about their favorite brand of fluorocarbon. They slap the logo on their jerseys and tell you that if you are not using it, you are leaving fish behind. But what they do not show you are the off-camera adjustments they make when the cameras are down and the water is frigid. Many of these top-tier guys quietly switch to copolymer or premium monofilament leaders when they need ultimate bait action in the dead of winter. The tackle companies want to sell you the most expensive spools of line on the shelf. Fluorocarbon commands a premium price, so naturally, that is what gets pushed the hardest. But your only job is to trick a fish into biting. Do not let million-dollar marketing campaigns convince you to use a product that actively hurts your presentation. One of the biggest arguments for fluorocarbon is sensitivity. People say it transfers vibration better than monofilament, and on a tight line, dragging a heavy football jig in warm water, that is absolutely true. But cold water fishing is often a game of slackline. You are letting baits fall slowly, you are pausing, you are giving the lure dead stick time. When fluorocarbon gets cold and stiff, it develops incredible memory. It holds the shape of the spool. So instead of a straight line running from your rod to your bait, you have a giant underwater slinky. All those stiff coils actually absorb the subtle tick of a winter bite. When a lethargic bass inhales your jig without turning, You will never feel it through those rigid coils of stiff fluorocarbon. A limper line, even one with a bit more stretch, will actually straighten out better under the light weight of your lure. A straighter line will transmit a subtle slack line bite far better than a coiled up mess. Think about a time when you have been out on the water on a bitter morning. You make a long cast with a spinning rod, using a fluorocarbon leader. You close the bail and look down at the water in front of you. What do you see? You do not see a sleek straight line cutting cleanly through the surface. You see loops. You see huge stiff spirals sitting on top of the water, refusing to sink properly because the line has retained the memory of the spool overnight in the cold garage. You try to pull the line tight to straighten it out, but the moment you give it any slack, it springs right back into those terrible coils. Now imagine what that looks like underwater. Your delicate lure is attached to the end of a stiff spring. Every time you move your rod tip, you are just pulling the spring tight, and then it recoils. Your bait is bouncing backward every time you pause. It is physically impossible to have a natural flowing presentation like that. Beyond just the presentation of the bait, we have to talk about something equally critical: knot strength. Fluorocarbon is already notorious for being finicky when it comes to knots. If you do not wet the knot perfectly, the line will burn itself during the cinch, weakening the connection. Now take that already tricky material and expose it to freezing temperatures. The line becomes brittle. When you try to tie a connecting knot to a stiff frozen piece of fluorocarbon, it becomes an absolute nightmare. The stiff material refuses to lay down flat. The wraps bite into each other unnaturally. I cannot tell you how many times I have seen guys lose giant fish on cold mornings because their perfectly tied knot snapped under the pressure of a hook set. The cold makes the fluorocarbon less forgiving. So not only is the stiff leader ruining your lure action, but it is also creating a massive weak point right where it matters most. So, what is the usual solution that guys try when they realize their fluorocarbon is too stiff in the cold? They decide to drop down and pound test. If 10 pound is too stiff, they will drop down to 6 pound or even 4 pound test to get that limpness back. And yes, a thinner diameter will absolutely give you a bit more flexibility and let your bait move slightly better. But this is a very dangerous game to play. When you are fishing around rocks, submerged timber, or docks, dropping down to spiderweb thin line is a recipe for heartbreak. You are sacrificing vital abrasion resistance just to make a stubborn material work in the wrong conditions. You hook into the biggest fish of the season, she makes one hard run across a sharp rock, and your ultra-thin leader snaps instantly. Instead of risking a break-off by using dangerously light line, it makes infinitely more sense to just switch to a different material that stays strong and limp. This brings us to a fantastic alternative that has been largely forgotten by modern anglers: copolymer line. If you are not familiar with it, copolymer is essentially a blend of different nylons. It was designed to bridge the gap between traditional monofilament and fluorocarbon. Copolymer sinks slightly better than pure monofilament, it has less stretch, and it is significantly more abrasion resistant. But the absolute magic of copolymer in cold water is that it does not turn into a rigid wire like pure fluorocarbon does. It retains a beautiful limp quality even when the water temperatures drop into the 30s. You can tie on a 10-pound copolymer leader and get the exact same lifelike flowing action from your lures as you would on a warm summer day. It casts beautifully, it manages slackline well, and it lets a suspending jerkbait sit perfectly horizontal. It is the perfect middle ground for winter fishing. And let us not completely write off standard monofilament either. Monofilament gets a really bad reputation nowadays. People act like fishing with mono is a severe handicap. But let us consider the stretch factor. In cold water, fish often swipe at baits lazily. They do not commit fully. They grab the very back hook of a jerkbait, or they suck in a jig and sit perfectly still. Because monofilament has a bit of give, a bit of natural stretch, it allows the fish to inhale the bait slightly deeper before they feel the resistance of the rod tip. A stiff fluorocarbon line transmits resistance instantly, and a spooky winter fish will spit the bait out before you even know they are there. The limpness of monofilament allows the lure to flow naturally right into the mouth of the fish. Plus, premium monofilament today is incredibly advanced. It stays buttery soft and highly manageable in the most brutal winter conditions. You really have to put yourself into the mind of a cold water fish. Their metabolism has slowed down to an absolute crawl. They are not chasing down fast-moving prey. They are looking for easy, helpless meals. A dying bait fish does not have sharp, jerky, aggressive movements. It twitches weakly. It floats gently. It drifts with the subtle underwater currents. To replicate that, you need a slack line and a supple leader. When you twitch your rod tip, the energy should roll down the line smoothly, translating into a soft darting action at the lure. If your leader is a stiff piece of fluorocarbon, that energy transfer is incredibly harsh. The lure darts too fast, stops too suddenly, and recoils backward because of the stiffness of the line. It looks completely unnatural to a predator. By switching to a supple leader, you are matching the natural, slow cadence of nature in the winter time. Now, some of you might be thinking about those magical line conditioner sprays. You know the ones. You spray them on your spool the night before a fishing trip, and they promise to keep your fluorocarbon soft, manageable, and memory-free. And to be fair, those sprays do work wonders for casting distance and managing line twist on a spinning reel. But let us be brutally honest here. A quick spritz of silicone spray is not going to alter the fundamental molecular structure of fluorocarbon once it is submerged in 38-degree water. The spray might help the line come off the spool smoother, but once that leader is down in the freezing depths, it is still going to harden up. It is a temporary band-aid fix for a much larger problem. You cannot spray away physics. Instead of spending $15 on a bottle of magic juice, you could just buy a spool of premium, limp leader material that actually works in the cold. A lot of us fish with a braided main line and tie on a leader. Braid is fantastic in the winter because it has absolutely zero memory. It stays totally limp no matter how cold it gets. But think about how ridiculous it is to use a limp, perfectly supple main line, only to tie 10 feet of stiff, wiry fluorocarbon to the end of it. You are completely neutralizing the advantage of the braided line. You have this beautiful direct connection to your lure, and then you bottleneck it with a stiff shock absorber right at the bait. When you shake a braided line, the vibration travels perfectly down to the connection knot. If you have a soft, pliable leader tied there, that vibration continues flawlessly down to the lure. If you hit a stiff piece of fluorocarbon, the vibration hits a solid wool. The limp braid just wiggles, while the stiff leader barely moves at all. You are defeating the entire purpose of your finesse setup. Let us step away from artificial lures for a second and talk about live bait. A lot of guys switch to live minnows or shiners when the water gets brutally cold. The entire point of using live bait is to let the bait do the work for you. You hook a shiner, toss it out, and let it swim around frantically to attract a big predator. But have you ever watched a small minnow try to swim while dragging a heavy frozen piece of fluorocarbon behind it? It is pathetic. The minnow tires out almost instantly. The stiffness of the line acts like a harness, keeping the bait fish pinned in one unnatural position. It cannot dart, it cannot flutter, and it dies twice as fast because it is exhausting itself fighting against the rigid line. If you switch out that leader to a soft, supple piece of monofilament, suddenly that same minnow has the freedom to swim naturally. It will stay lively longer and draw significantly more strikes. If you fish in rivers or any body of water with a current, the stiff leader problem becomes even more pronounced. In cold water river situations, a natural drift is absolutely everything. You want your bait to tumble along the bottom exactly like a dead insect or a stunned bait fish being pushed by the flow. Water current naturally catches on your fishing line. A soft, supple line will bow and bend with the complex microcurrents under the water, allowing the bait to roll naturally over the rocks. A stiff fluorocarbon leader catches the current like a rigid sail. The water pushes against the stiff wire, and instead of letting the bait tumble, it aggressively drags the bait in unnatural sweeping motions. The fish sit behind current breaks, waiting for natural food to wash by. When they see a jig sweeping across the bottom in a rigid, forced arc, they know instantly that something is terribly wrong with your presentation. Ultimately, this all comes down to being a smarter, more adaptable angler. We have to stop blindly following the crowd. Just because a spool of fluorocarbon costs over $30 does not mean it is the magical answer to every single fishing situation. Fishing requires constant adaptability. You change your lure colors based on water clarity. You change your bait size based on what the fish are feeding on. Why would you not change your leader material based on the water temperature? When the frost hits the ground and the water temperature plummets, you need to prioritize the flowing action of your lure above everything else. Invisibility means absolutely nothing if your bait looks dead and unnatural. Go dig through your garage, find that old spool of premium monofilament, or order a high-quality copolymer. Tie it on next time you head out into the cold. I guarantee you will notice an immediate difference in how your lures move. So, here is the ultimate plot twist. When the water gets freezing cold, that $10 spool of old-school monofilament will absolutely destroy that $30 spool of premium Japanese fluorocarbon. It is completely backwards to what we have been taught, but physics do not lie. By switching to a limper, softer material in the winter, you free your bait from that stiff wire harness. You bring the natural, breathing, fluttering action back to your lures, and that is exactly what triggers a cold, lethargic fish to finally bite. It changes your entire approach because you stop fighting the conditions and start matching them. Thank you so much for watching. If this video opened your eyes and gave you a new perspective on winter fishing, hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a like and head down into the comments. Tell me the truth. What leader material do you actually trust when the lake is almost frozen over? Let us get a discussion going.